You're being replaced. Those words hit like a cold gust of wind through the heart of the place I called home for 17 years. My name is Frank Delaney, and for nearly 2 decades, I was the man behind the heartbeat of Delta Forge manufacturing in Columbus, Ohio. While others came and went, I stayed. Writing the firmware, tuning the calibration systems, and keeping the old machines humming like a church choir on Sunday morning. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but my systems had the lowest defect rate in the region, and they kept us afloat when competitors were folding. Then came Erica Nolan, a young plant manager with an MBA and a head full of buzzwords. She had been with the company barely 8 months when she stood in front of the team one cold Thursday morning and announced we were modernizing. Her words were smooth, but her eyes never met mine. "We've partnered with Nexora Labs," she said. "Their AI-powered management systems will bring us into the future." Unfortunately, some roles, including legacy system management, are becoming redundant. In other words, I was out. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just walked back to my station, unplugged the laptop I had used for years, and packed my drawer, coffee mug, spare glasses, and a little notebook full of handwritten calibration codes. Erica handed me a folder with my severance 2 months' pay and my vacation time. "Try to understand, Frank," she said. "This is just the direction the industry is moving." I looked her in the eye. Good luck keeping it running without me. The factory behind me kept humming, but I knew the tune was about to change. 3 weeks passed, then 6. I spent the days fishing, updating my resume, and doing my best to feel useful in a world that suddenly had no place for men like me. The machines I'd nurtured for years started to break down. The Southwest conveyor, which I had warned them needed firmware updates before the cold months hit, started glitching. Operators couldn't fix it. Nexora's fancy AI didn't have a clue what to do. That's when the phone rang. It was Erica. Her voice wasn't so polished now. "We're having some issues with the conveyor line," she said. "Is there any chance you'd be available for a short consultation?" I didn't hesitate. $300 an hour, 4-hour minimum, payment up front, contract required, silence. Then, "Let me get back to you." She called back an hour later. They agreed to everything. It took me 27 minutes to fix what Nexora's engineers couldn't in 2 weeks. I pulled up the calibration files from my personal backups. I hadn't left them out of spite. I just knew no one would understand them but me. "Thank you," Erica said, looking equal parts relieved and embarrassed. I closed my laptop. "Will there be anything else?" "Well, we're having similar issues with the CNC machines in Bay 3. "That's outside the scope of today's work," I replied. "If you'd like me to take a look, I'll need a new contract." From that point on, the calls kept coming. Once a week at first, then twice. Each time they needed something, I raised my rate slightly. Each time, they paid. They had no choice. 2 months after my dismissal, I got a different call. This time it was Ronald Pierce, Vice President of Operations at our parent company, TriPoint Freight. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "our Columbus facility is in crisis. Quality control has collapsed. We've lost 2 aerospace contracts. Warranty claims are through the roof. I understand you've been assisting on a case-by-case basis." "That's correct. We'd like a full-time consulting contract. 6 months. Clean up the mess and document your systems." I paused. What happened to Nexora? "We're re-evaluating the partnership." Translation, they were being shown the door. I named a price that was triple what I made as an employee. He didn't blink. "We'll have contracts drawn up by the end of the day." Back at the factory, I found more damage than I expected. Nexora had tried to reverse engineer my firmware, but their algorithms corrupted the calibration protocols. Over 30% of parts were failing inspection. But the kicker: I found a document on the company server, Erica's original pitch to the board. She promised $200 in savings by replacing me with Nexora with a temporary 3% increase in defects. She thought she could cut quality to save money, and no one would notice. I didn't get angry. I got to work. I rebuilt the factory's systems one machine at a time. Then I built something better. I called it Forge Site, a fully integrated operations platform that linked every piece of equipment, tracked performance in real time, predicted maintenance needs, and made trade-offs between cost and quality crystal clear. 3 months later, I presented ForgeSight to the board. They signed on for a long-term deal, licensing the system from my newly founded company, Delaney Precision Solutions. My job now: come in twice a week, ensure everything runs smooth, and cash checks while doing what I love. Erica. She was fired. It turns out she'd been collecting unauthorized consulting fees from Nexura. A conflict of interest she thought no one would ever uncover. Stratton instituted a new policy requiring all modernization plans to include quality impact assessments and long-term support protocols. They call it the Delaney Directive. 1 year after I was made redundant, I stood in my own downtown office with a team of engineers and technicians under my wing. My daughter, now an industrial engineer herself, had joined the team. She once told me, "Dad, you didn't just build a system. You built a legacy." She's right. They tried to replace me with software. Now they license my name. Because some things, like experience, integrity, and pride in your craft, just can't be automated. By the time ForgeSight was operational in its 4th plant, I'd stopped thinking of myself as former employee material. I was now the name clients whispered when they had problems no software could fix. The board at TriPoint Freight was pleased. Defect rates dropped company-wide. Contracts that had been on shaky ground were renewed. I even got a thank you card. Yes, an actual card from one of the aerospace clients. That felt better than any bonus I'd ever received in 17 years on the payroll. But I wasn't done. While implementing ForgeSight, I made an unsettling discovery. Nexura's interference had caused long-term data loss in key production logs. Thousands of parts had been shipped out with tolerances just outside the threshold, and no one had flagged it. The AI simply wasn't built to interpret edge case variables. The modern solution had silently let quality slip until the consequences became visible. That's when I realized something deeper was broken. Not just the systems, but the thinking. The very decision-making process inside these executive suites had turned into a numbers game where they measured everything except wisdom. So I asked myself a question: how do you protect institutional knowledge when the institution itself doesn't understand its value? My answer was simple: make it profitable. ForgeSight wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a philosophy, one that tied human experience directly to measurable performance. It logged not only metrics, but context. Why a particular setting had been adjusted, what environmental conditions triggered a certain machine behavior, even which technician had implemented a solution. These annotations, once scribbled in someone's notebook or passed around during lunch breaks, were now woven into the codebase of the system itself. If I couldn't make them respect the man, I'd make them respect the method. At a quarterly review with the Stratton board, I stood before a projector showing a side-by-side chart. Year 1 with Nexura, Year 2 with ForgeSight. They didn't even ask questions until I got to the final slide. Estimated cost savings over 5 years. 12.4 million, not counting regained contracts. One of the board members, a quiet gentleman in a navy blue suit, leaned forward. "Why didn't we do this from the beginning?" I smiled. "Because you didn't know what you didn't know. And neither did Nexura." Nobody in the room laughed, but they all nodded. That night, in my hotel room, I opened an email from Patricia Winters, the new COO. She had just left a conference in Pittsburgh, where, apparently, a similar Nexura-led modernization had triggered major delays and customer complaints. "Your system spotted early failure indicators before Pittsburgh even knew they had a problem," she wrote. "That's twice now. Your instincts are saving us millions." She ended the email with a line that stuck with me. ForgeSight is more than software. It's what happens when experience becomes infrastructure. I poured myself a bourbon and raised a silent toast. 6 months later, we were featured on the cover of Manufacturing Insight magazine. Headline: Bridging the Knowledge Gap, How Delaney Precision Solutions is Rewriting the Rules. The article painted me as some kind of industrial cowboy, part engineer, part watchdog, part reformer. That wasn't entirely wrong, but the work was far from over. At the time, I had 12 employees, including Leon, who had become my second in command. We were onboarding 3 new clients and beginning development on a Forge site light version for small to mid-sized factories. I was in talks with 2 universities about incorporating our system into their industrial engineering curriculum. And then came the call. It was from Harold Velwin, the original founder of Delta Forge, now long retired. He'd heard about what happened to his old company under Nexura's brief reign. He wanted to buy it back from Stratton. "I want it run the right way again," he told me. "Would you come on board as an advisor?" That hit harder than I expected. Not because of nostalgia, but because it meant something that a man who had once trusted me straight out of college now wanted my help to rebuild. Not as an employee, as a partner. I told him I'd consider it. That fall, I stood with Leon in our new Columbus office. Modest, clean, efficient. The kind of place built not to impress, but to function. I looked around at my team, people who understood machines, yes, but more importantly, people who understood why the work mattered. Leon handed me a tablet. Base 6 sensor replacement complete. Tolerances all green. I nodded, then looked out the window at the line of trucks pulling away from the factory, each carrying products built under the quiet discipline of experience. "Frank," Leon said, "you ever think about what would have happened if they hadn't fired you?" "All the time?" I said. "And every time, I thank God they did. Because sometimes, the worst day of your career is the first step toward becoming irreplaceable. And in a world that forgets what it once knew, the greatest power you can hold is remembering." I never thought I'd see the day when institutional knowledge would become a buzzword. But that's exactly what happened a year after I launched ForgeSight. What used to be dismissed as the way the old-timers did things suddenly had value again. Because systems were failing, contracts were falling apart, and executives across the industry were finally realizing something you can't automate: experience. It started when the Manufacturing Council of America invited me to speak on a panel. The irony. The same conference Jessica Barnes once headlined with her talk about disrupting outdated processes. Her name was nowhere to be seen this time. And I wasn't there to preach revolution. I came to talk about preservation. Every time a veteran walks out the factory door without passing down their knowledge, I told the audience, it's like setting fire to a library. I saw heads nodding. Gray-haired supervisors, retired engineers, and a few forward-thinking managers who were finally connecting the dots. After my talk, I was swarmed with handshakes and business cards. A man from a steel fabrication company in Minnesota said, "We're on our 3rd ERP system in 4 years. The only thing that's worked consistently is Bob in maintenance." But Bob's 66 and thinking about retiring. Can your system capture what he knows? It could. And it did. ForgeSight wasn't just monitoring machines anymore. It was mapping minds, recording process flows, decision points, and technician insights in real time. We built voice-to-text modules that let workers narrate what they were doing and why, creating a living archive of their expertise. We called it Legacy Link. It caught on fast. Within months, we'd onboarded 6 more clients, including a military subcontractor in Alabama and a biomedical assembly plant in Oregon. They didn't want just software, they wanted insurance. Assurance. A way to protect themselves from knowledge loss. And in every meeting, I said the same thing. This isn't about replacing people. It's about making their wisdom permanent. Then came the surprise. The Department of Labor called, not to investigate, but to collaborate. They wanted to create a national framework to preserve industrial expertise in aging workforces. They'd heard about our work and asked if Delaney Precision Solutions would consult on the initiative. I agreed on one condition, that the program be named after someone who understood what legacy meant. We called it the Hartley Project, after my late aunt, the woman who once told me to build something that lasts. Her name now appears on every training module we distribute nationwide. Back in Columbus, our office had tripled in size. Leon was managing operations. My daughter, Emma, had taken over product design. Watching her lead a team of young engineers who actually listened to the wisdom in our system, that was a different kind of satisfaction. One not built on pride, but continuity. I spent most days now as the quiet force behind the curtain, reviewing expansion proposals, taking calls from new clients, mentoring people who reminded me of the kid I used to be. Ambitious, idealistic, and totally unaware of how much they didn't yet know. I still consulted for TriPoint Freight when needed, though their need for me had diminished, not because I became less valuable, but because my systems made them more self-reliant. And that, in a strange way, was the ultimate compliment. One afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. "Frank, this is Roger Linwood, Chief Technology Officer at ArcLight Manufacturing." I'd heard the name. Mid-sized operation. Had recently acquired 3 struggling plants in the Midwest. "We're trying to bring them back online," he said. All of them ran on homegrown systems. No manuals, no documentation. Just folks who left or retired. "I've seen that movie," I said. He chuckled. "We found something else. An old backup server with folders labeled Frank D. Caleb's and Velwin settings." "That's you." I smiled. "Sounds familiar." "We need your help." 3 weeks later, I walked into one of those plants. Everything was coated in dust. Machines idle, control panels blinking errors. Technicians shrugging. It felt like stepping back in time. But to me, it was like picking up an old instrument I hadn't played in years. In one corner was a workstation. Same software I'd written over a decade ago. Still running. Still intact. That folder labeled Frank D. Caleb's. It was my firmware, my code. No one had touched it since I left. I spent 2 days mapping the system and 3 more restoring it. By the end of the week, production was back online. Not perfect, not modern, but stable. As I was leaving, Roger walked me to my truck. "Why didn't anyone ever document this?" he asked, half frustrated, half awed. "They never asked," I said. "They just assumed they could replace me with something sheenier." He nodded. "Not anymore." That night, sitting on my porch, I thought about all the names I used to see on the shop floor. Good people with good hands and better instincts. Most had retired or passed on. Their methods lost, their choices undocumented. Gone like dust in the wind. But not anymore. With LegacyLink and ForgeSight expanding into education, compliance, and even government infrastructure, we weren't just preserving knowledge. We were giving it roots in places where it never had a chance to grow before. 1 year later, I received an award from the American Industrial Heritage Foundation. It wasn't for innovation. It was for preservation. As I stood at the podium, I looked out at a sea of faces, some young, some weathered, all connected by the unspoken truth of the trade's machine's age. Software crashes. But human insight, that's the one thing worth saving. I wasn't supposed to come back to Velwin. That chapter had closed the moment I walked out, carrying a cardboard box full of 17 years of knowledge no one thought they needed. But life, as I'd come to learn, has a strange way of circling back, especially when you build things that endure. It started with a call from Harold Velwin himself. Now in his early 80s and long retired, Harold had watched from a distance as his old company crumbled under the weight of short-sighted leadership and flashy tech that never delivered. Jessica Barnes' removal had made the local business journals, but what hit harder was the financials lost contracts, quality control disasters, and a reputation in tatters. So Harold reached out, not as a businessman, but as a man watching his legacy erode. "Frank," he said, voice slower than I remembered, "I need your help. I want to buy Velwin back." At first, I thought he was joking. But Harold was dead serious. He'd quietly assembled a group of investors, former engineers, suppliers, even 2 retired plant managers. People who believed in what Velwin had once stood for, and they wanted me to lead the rebuild. It wasn't just about factories and firmware anymore. We were fighting for the soul of an industry, one that had traded wisdom for dashboards and experience for buzzwords. I agreed under one condition, that we wouldn't just fix Velwin. We'd transform it into a model of sustainable manufacturing built on integrity, transparency, and legacy-driven leadership. That meant bringing ForgeSight and LegacyLink fully into the company's infrastructure. Not as a vendor, but as the core operating system. It meant Leon, my right hand, was now overseeing factory retraining programs. And it meant that every person over the age of 55 still working the floor got a voice in how we designed systems moving forward. Not to slow progress, but to make sure it worked in the real world, not just the conference room. The impact was almost immediate. Defect rates dropped within weeks. But more importantly, morale returned. Guys who had stopped caring started mentoring again. Young techs stopped second, guessing themselves because they had audio logs from master machinists explaining every detail of how to calibrate a cutter or diagnose a faulty sensor. It wasn't just software, it was confidence. And that confidence turned into productivity, which turned into profits, which turned into contracts returning. One by one, old clients came back, but not everyone was thrilled. When word spread that Velwyn was being rebuilt on legacy, first systems, a few industry commentators scoffed. One blog post called it nostalgia engineering. Another claimed we were romanticizing inefficiency. I didn't respond publicly, but I did send them a link. It led to a live dashboard of our real-time metrics: 98.7% uptime, 0.6% defect rate, and over 12 million in recovered annual revenue, all documented by the Veltec platform they said was outdated. Numbers don't need arguments. 2 months into our rebuild, I hosted a town hall at Velwyn HQ. Employees from every level filled the auditorium, operators in work boots, analysts in polos, engineers with coffee stains on their tablets. For the first time in years, they weren't there to listen to a new policy. They were there to help shape one. We're not chasing Silicon Valley, I told them. We're setting our own standard. That's when I unveiled the next phase, Velwyn Legacy Academy, a formal apprenticeship and documentation program pairing seasoned workers with new hires, not just to teach how to do the job, but to explain why. Everything would be recorded. Everything would be preserved. In 10 years, when the last of our original machinists retires, their voices will still echo through every workstation, every training module, every dashboard. One morning, Leon barged into my office holding a folder. "You're not going to believe this," he said, grinning. It was a proposal from the Department of Commerce. They'd seen our work with ForgeSight and wanted to license a national version of LegacyLink for government, run technical schools, and veterans retraining programs. "You'd be the lead contractor," Leon said. "The face of it." I laughed. "Me? The same guy they pushed out for being too old school?" "Exactly," he said. "No, they're paying to learn from the old school." We signed the deal 6 weeks later. ForgeSight became the backbone of a federal initiative to standardize industrial retraining programs across 17 states. And for the first time in my life, I was invited to Washington, D.C., not to lobby, but to teach. Standing in a room full of policymakers and educators, I explained the difference between training someone to push buttons and training them to solve problems. "Automation is powerful," I said, "but it's nothing without interpretation. And interpretation comes from experience." 1 year after Harold bought Velwyn back, he retired again. This time for good. At the farewell event, he pulled me aside. "You built something I never could, Frank," he said. "A system that doesn't just run machines. It remembers people." He handed me a small box. Inside was the brass nameplate from my original workstation, engraved with nothing but Delaney. "I took it off before they erased your memory," he said. "No, you've made it permanent." That night, back in my office overlooking the Grand River, I opened a bottle of bourbon I'd been saving for years. The lights of the city shimmered outside. My daughter Emma texted, "Just landed a big pitch. Your training videos helped more than you know." "Thank you, Dad." I stared at that message for a long time. Not because of pride, but because of peace. I'd done what Aunt Elaine asked all those years ago: build something that lasts. And now, as the industry turned to face the future, they were finally realizing some things aren't meant to be replaced. They're meant to be respected. One spring morning, while I was reviewing the system updates at Velwyn's 4th facility, Leon walked in with a look that mixed surprise and skepticism. "Frank," he said, holding a freshly printed stack of documents, "someone's asking for you." "Someone from Trident Era Tech." I looked up from my tablet, brows knitting slightly. Trident was one of the clients that had left Velwyn when things went downhill after my termination. "They want to come back?" I asked. "Not just come back," Leon replied. "They want something only you can offer." We held a Zoom meeting with their head of engineering, a man named Roger Mendez. He didn't waste time with small talk. We tried the same full modernization approach Velwin used, he said, his voice tight, until our automation system started pushing out errors no one caught. 2 shipments were returned. One of them nearly caused an accident at an assembly plant. He paused, eyes serious. We don't just need quality control. We need to understand our systems. And from what I hear, that's exactly what Veltec does. That's when it hit me. What I'd built wasn't just production software. It had become a new standard, a philosophy of operations that didn't separate people from machines, but blended lived experience with modern technology. I offered TriPoint a 90-day trial implementation with full support. If the results didn't meet expectations, they wouldn't owe the first-year licensing fee. Roger nodded. You believe in your system that much? He asked. I looked him in the eye. Not just the system. I believe in how we build trust between people and technology. 3 months later, they didn't just sign on for one plant. They rolled Veltec out across all 7 of their manufacturing facilities nationwide. Word spread quickly across the industry. Engineering journals began referencing the Veltec phenomenon as a quiet revolution in American manufacturing. Conferences that once ignored me now sent formal invitations to speak. I took the main stage at the Future of American Manufacturing Summit, addressing hundreds of executives. Not about AI or robotics, but about the value of labor knowledge that had been pushed aside and nearly forgotten. After my keynote, a man approached. He introduced himself as George Elkins, Vice President of Strategy at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Frank, he said, we're looking for scalable models to take nationwide, especially those that reconnect experienced workers with the next generation. Would you consider advising a federal workforce program? I took a moment before answering. I'm not sure I'm cut out for politics, I admitted. George laughed. We're not asking for politics. We're asking you to do what you do best. Build something that'll last another 20 years. Around that same time, Leon reported that 2 of Velwin's biggest competitors had started making offers to buy Veltec outright. But I didn't sell. Instead, I offered them something else, a licensing agreement that came with mandatory workforce training and a requirement to document and honor veteran worker expertise. A few companies passed, but the ones who stayed, not only did they agree, they asked for help building teams just like we had at Velwin. Then came the email that stopped me mid-sentence. It was from Emily Barnes, Jessica's younger sister. Frank, it began, I know my sister made a lot of wrong choices. After the internal investigation into her commissions from Nixora, our family was in crisis. But one thing she never told anyone. She admired how you ran things. I found an old hard drive of hers. It had copies of your workflow presentations, annotated with notes like, need to learn how Frank manages this. I just wanted to say, thank you for proving that people can be misjudged, but still never lose their true worth. I didn't respond, but I printed that email and placed it next to my daughter's graduation photo, the one where she said, Dad, you didn't just start over. You turned the wreckage into a whole new platform for others to stand on. 1 year later, I received a letter from the Office of the President. I was to be awarded the National Industrial Citizen Medal for my contribution to preserving practical knowledge in the digital age. As I walked across the stage to accept the award, my mind didn't flash to code libraries, firmware updates, or million-dollar contracts. It went back to that moment in my car 17 months earlier. Cardboard box in hand, no job, no direction. Just grit. From someone fired for being too outdated, I had become the new standard in modern manufacturing. And sometimes, boss, the sweetest revenge is when they're forced to relearn everything from you. On the morning of the 2-year anniversary since I walked out of Velwin, I stood before the glass wall of the 9th floor at Lee Industrial Systems' new headquarters in Grand Rapids. Through the crystal clear pane, the Grand River flowed steadily like an old friend. Trees lining the bank had started turning the warm gold of early autumn. I took a slow sip of coffee, then turned back to my desk, where 3 strategic partnership agreements from major manufacturing firms awaited my signature. One name stood out among them, TriPoint Freight, the very parent company that had once deemed me obsolete and signed off on my removal from Velwyn. The desk phone rang. "Mr. Lee, you have a call from Harold Velwyn," my assistant said. A wry smile crept across my face. I hadn't heard that name in years. The man who had once placed his trust in me fresh out of college was now calling me not as a boss, but as a fellow businessman. "Frank," came the familiar, gravelly voice. "They're in talks to sell Velwyn back to me. I want you to help me bring it back to its roots." I didn't hesitate, not because I still owed anything to Velwyn, but because I owed Harold the chance to prove that trust, when placed wisely, builds legacies. A week later, Leon and I returned to Velwyn, not as employees, but as official guests. For the first time in 2 years, I walked into the factory, where I had spent nearly 2 decades of my life. Jessica was gone, so were the Nexor engineers. The glitch-ridden systems that once replaced me had been quietly retired. In their place, Veltech, running smoothly. But it wasn't the tech that caught my attention. It was the people. The same faces who had once watched me pack my things with silent pity now nodded with quiet respect. I didn't hold it against them. No one had spoken up for me then, but now they understood. No performance metric can replace the intuition and resilience of an experienced engineer. We gathered the new leadership team for a meeting. I opened the presentation with a single question. What's worth more? A machine that learns on its own, or a human who's learned never to make the same mistake twice? The room fell silent. I laid out a restructuring plan, not of technology, but of culture. Every system update would now require operator verification. Every process change would be tested by someone who had solved real problems, not just read about them. And most importantly, I proposed the formation of a new division, the Knowledge Core, a living archive of every hard-earned lesson in Velwyn's production history. From across the table, Leon gave a subtle nod. He knew exactly what I meant. He remembered the nights we sat in storage rooms, rewriting a control loop, because a sensor lagged by half a second. The weekends I stayed up calibrating old equipment just so 5 workers wouldn't lose their jobs. I hadn't just protected systems. I had protected the people behind them. 3 months later, the Knowledge Core was operational. For the first time, veteran workers like Carl, the maintenance tech who'd been there before the robots, were invited to train new engineers. The shift was visible on their faces from suspicion to pride. In one session, Carl said something I'll never forget. "I always thought I was just someone who knew how to fix things. Now I know I've got something worth passing on." Our story reached as far as Washington, D.C. American Industrial Weekly ran a headline, "Velwyn reclaims its legacy through wisdom, not just wires." I was invited to testify before Congress on the future of American manufacturing. When a senator asked, "Do you believe machines will replace skilled labor within the next 10 years?" I replied, "No. But I believe we'll replace companies that fail to value skilled labor in the next 10 months." That soundbite went viral. Over 2 million shares in 48 hours. But what I'm most proud of sat quietly on my desk, a handwritten letter from my daughter. "Dad," she wrote, "I just accepted my first job as a production supervisor. I used your Veltech pitch in my interview. Thank you for teaching me not just how to code, but how to keep things running right, with conscience." I folded the letter and placed it next to a scale model of the first CNC machine I ever programmed. A symbol of where it all began, and where I now stood. No one calls me outdated anymore. No system dares to sideline me for being too traditional. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to make the world realize one truth. When people think you've outlived your value, that's usually when you're just starting to build something no one else can replace. 1 year to the day after I signed the first consulting contract, I stood in the observation deck of the Velwyn Grand Rapids facility once again. But this time, I wasn't an employee. I wasn't even a contractor. I was a partner. The factory floor below buzzed with purposeful motion. Conveyors humming in sync, CNC machines calibrating with digital precision, and technicians checking systems using the Veltech interface we had built from scratch. From where I stood, I could see the numbers on the central monitor, defect rates down by 82%, machine uptime at an all-time high, and customer returns at nearly zero. Behind me, a quiet knock. Leon stepped in, wearing his new badge, Senior Operations Director, Lee Industrial Systems. They just wrapped the audit for the Pittsburgh site, he said, grinning. Passed with flying colors. No discrepancies. Inspector even asked for a Veltec demo. I nodded. Good. That's 4 sites in a row. They're starting to trust the system. He stepped closer. They're starting to trust you again, Frank. I turned to look out the window again. Not just me. Us. This place runs because we remembered what matters. Not just data, but the people who know what that data means. Leon nodded and tapped his badge. Couldn't have done it without you taking that leap. Later that week, I was invited to speak at the National Manufacturing Summit in Chicago. I wasn't sure I wanted the spotlight, but the panel title caught my eye. Legacy and Innovation, Where Experience Meets Technology. I accepted. At the summit, standing before hundreds of executives, engineers, and students, I opened with a photo of a dusty notebook, one I used to carry in my back pocket, full of handwritten code, calibration tweaks, and ideas scribbled during late night shifts. This, I said, used to be how we kept factories running. Not because it was flashy, but because we knew every inch of every machine. We listened when they made strange noises. We spotted trouble before the sensors did. That's not old-fashioned. That's wisdom. The room was silent. I clicked to the next slide, a screenshot of the Veltec dashboard. This is how we do it now. The interface is modern, the alerts are digital, and the analytics are smart. But underneath it, still that same notebook. Still those same instincts. Just translated into something shareable, scalable, teachable. A young man in the front row raised his hand. How do we make sure we don't lose that knowledge as older workers retire? I smiled. You don't preserve knowledge by locking it in a vault. You pass it down. You give people a reason to stay, a reason to teach, and you show the next generation that there's value in doing things right, not just fast. After the talk, an older gentleman approached me, hair silver, eyes sharp. My son just started at a plant outside Atlanta, he said. He doesn't get why I double, check everything. Says the sensors will catch it. I'm going to send him your speech. I shook his hand. Tell him that the sensors are good, but they don't care if someone gets hurt. You do. That's the difference. That night back in my hotel room, I poured myself a glass of water and looked out over the city. The lights below flickered like a circuit board, alive, connected, full of possibilities. I thought about Aunt Rachel, who used to tell me, you don't build a legacy by being loud. You build it by being the one they call when the lights go out. And they had called. One by one, site by site, crisis by crisis. Not because I had all the answers, but because I'd spent years asking the right questions. To anyone out there who's ever been told they're too old, too analog, too behind the times, let me tell you something. You're not outdated. You're underappreciated. The world will always chase shiny new tools. But when those tools fail, it's the hands that remember how to hold a wrench, the minds that remember how the system breathes, that will matter most. Experience isn't something to retire. It's something to respect, protect, and pass on. And if you're sitting there thinking your best days are behind you, let me remind you of this. Sometimes getting pushed out is what finally gives you the space to build something of your own. Something lasting. Something that makes them look back and say, we didn't realize how much we needed them until we lost them. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone you know, someone who gave their all, quietly and without complaint, leave a comment below and share their name. Let's give them the recognition they deserve. And if you want more stories about resilience, redemption, and real world wisdom, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications.